Okay, guys, so we are starting a new unit, probably one of the most important units in this class, in the sense that I'm going to present you with some statistics that indicate addiction of a variety of kinds is a very big problem in the United States. And traditionally, when we think about addiction, like if you take my psychology of mental illness class, you learned about the substance and alcohol addictions. But in health psychology, I expand this discussion to talk about other forms of addiction that are controversial um, and are not historically anyway things that we considered addictive processes like food addiction, like internet addiction, like sex addiction, which comes up frequently in the media. These are not part of our traditional sort of sense of addiction because we think of alcohol and drugs. In my health psych class, I talk about these other forms of addictions and the controversies associated with them because these are all things that can impact our health and not just substances or alcohol. And because they are controversial, I do like to bring them up in this class, which has a more comprehensive view of health, not just health from a mental illness perspective or a psychiatric illness perspective, like in my other class that many of you have taken or will take maybe next year. So we are starting our addiction, I can't talk, guys, our addictive processes unit. And I always like to contextualize anything I talk about with some statistics and some data, being a very data-driven person and coming from psychological science, which a data-driven field. I want you to sort of have a context for the things that we talk about. So if you'll notice on the slide, a U.S. News article 5 years ago, 2015, indicated some important data. Recent Columbia University study, 40 million Americans age 12 and older. I want you to think about what you were doing when you were 12. 12 and older meet the clinical criteria. So the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, diagnostic criteria for addiction involving nicotine and not just smoking. Remember, there's different ways to get nicotine now, vaping, right? Other forms of nicotine intake. Nicotine, alcohol, or other drugs. More Americans than those with heart disease, diabetes, or cancer. I want you to really think about that. There are more Americans, according to the study by Columbia University, age 12 and older, who meet the addiction criteria than a combination of Americans who meet heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. That's pretty amazing. An estimated additional 80 million Americans are, quote, risky substance users. So what this typically means is they are subclinical. They might not meet all of the specified requisite criteria for a diagnosis of substance use disorder in the DSM, but they have enough criteria that it's still considered clinically relevant, potentially problematic in terms of detracting from one's psychological, physical, and social health. Tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs are being used in ways that threaten not only individual health, but public health. So we're talking about the impact of individual decision-making on public health and safety. And what do I mean by this? Okay, if an individual or a set of individuals has an alcohol use problem and they drive drunk, that's a public health problem because an innocent person could be hit by a drunk driver and physically maimed, harmed, or worse, killed. The estimate is that this risky substance use amongst Americans costs the government a significant amount of money. And that's not even counting family out-of-pocket or private insurance expenses. Just the government, $468 billion annually. Can you even conceptualize of the amount of money that we're talking about and why? Again, hospital costs, accident costs, damage to private and public property, lawsuits, the gamut. Over 38,000 people died of drug overdoses in the U.S. in 2010. That's 10 years ago, greater than the deaths attributed to motor vehicle accidents, homicides, and suicides. Think about that. more people dying from drug overdoses than car accident deaths, one person killing another, homicide deaths, and self-harm or suicide deaths. And these are typically overdose deaths from opioids, narcotic opioids, like OxyContin, which is widely abused, Percodan, methadone, heroin. These have become, this class of drugs, these narcotic opiates, have become the fastest growing drug problem in the US today, and sadly, a very serious problem amongst our youth. Addiction brings multiple problems, not just physical health problems, not just psychological health problems, not just social health problems, but financial and legal problems. People often commit property or violent crimes when they are under the influence or trying to steal money so that they can purchase more drugs to feed their addiction. It increases domestic violence, child abuse, unplanned pregnancies, because people aren't obviously thinking clearly when they're under the influence and making poor decisions. And of course, motor vehicle accidents if people are driving under the influence of alcohol and or other substances. Finally, I gave you a link. I want you to take a look at this on your own. I gave you a link to a source that gives you information about the number of people in prison because of drug crimes. There is data to suggest a very large portion of incarcerated persons in the US in our prison system actually have addiction problems, and many are actually in jail as a result of untreated addiction. And in many cases, the crimes they committed would likely not have been committed if their addiction had been treated. But unfortunately, in prison, they're not getting requisite treatment. So please take a look at that source. You can click on it and it gives you lots of factual information about the relationship between incarcerated persons and drug crimes in particular. And then on the next slide, I will meet you there and we will talk about some of the definitions of substance use disorders from a clinical standpoint.